Thank you. In fact, not only from the area, but my wife was born in Chisholm. Now, she doesn't remember very much about it. In fact, I don't think she knows where the house is or anything, but anyway, which of course explains something that while I think of myself as a full-blooded Norwegian, I've been very much exposed to Finnish culture. I've had to. Well, this morning, I'm going to talk about a number of things, shall we say, building on the base that three very fine speakers have given you, Pat and Ed and Verlin. And while I may refer a little back to some of the subjects they've been talking about, my intention is really to concentrate on Norwegians and how one can learn more about them. But I do have to go back a little. Pat very nicely gave you some reasons for doing genealogy. I'm going to give you one more. And I'm becoming more and more persuaded that I'm right on this. This last week we had a letter from a lady. She said, I need your help. I'm adopted. I have discovered the names of my natural parents, and one of them is Norwegian. I have a rare blood disease, and I have to find some near relatives because I suspect maybe she needs a bone marrow transplant or something like that. Well, that's one case. Another, and this relates to this area in a sense, I had a phone call from Duluth 3, 4, 5 years ago. The lady said something like this: I understand you've copied lots of cemeteries. I hope you've copied all of the ones in California. Well, I hadn't copied a single one, but the problem was just as serious. She said, I need to know how Grandpa died, because there is increasing evidence in our family that maybe we have Huntington's chorea, which is a very bad kind of insanity. All I'm saying is that maybe an extra reason for genealogists filling in names and dates and places is to get a base for perhaps some genetic study of the kind that will help us maybe do some family planning, certainly some planning for our families that will anticipate perhaps some difficulties later on. As Pat showed some of her forms up on the screen earlier today, I noticed the cause of death in one case was arteriosclerosis. Well, I ain't sure, but I have a feeling that things like that tend to be transmitted from one family to another. I watch myself pretty carefully because I know that on both sides of my family there have been cases of diabetes. Well, that tells me something. All I'm saying is maybe we ought to do more than we have been doing in filling out these charts to show not only the cause of death, but some other things that have affected the lives of our family. We have an adopted daughter in our family who is seriously ill with multiple sclerosis. Well, we were quizzed the other day, and they asked me, well, now, is there any evidence of glaucoma in your family? And I says, there sure is, but it has nothing to do with the case in hand. I don't know whether if there's glaucoma back in her family at all. And so I'm just telling you that adding to the fine presentations that have been made, there may be another reason for what we are all about, and it's a serious reason. Well, let's get to the Norwegians. Again, maybe I should start with a couple of good reasons why you should learn more about your ancestors and families, and in this case, I'm talking Norwegian. 3, 4 years ago, I went out to the Høstfest in Minot, and there was a television crew from Norway wandering around. And I met the head of the crew. He wanted to ask me about a famous Norwegian skier. After we'd done our business on that, I said, now I have a question for you. I said, there's a lady over in Norway who has the same last name as you, and she and I share the same great-grandfather. Oh, he said, tell me more. So I told him her name, and he says, whoa, that's my wife, and next time you come to Norway, you're going to come to visit me. That kind of thing. The more you learn, the more, shall we say, fascination you can have with Well, your roots. 1973, I was doing research in Hamar, Norway. And I was staying at the home of the regional archivist, and we'd go down to his archives every day and work, and then we'd come home. And one night, when we got home, he says, "We're invited out to dinner tonight." And we went out to a lovely old home, really a large mansion called Ottestad in a community called Stange, and had a wonderful time. Well, when I got home the next day, I decided I should learn something about one of my Valdres great-great-grandmothers. And I knew she'd come from Stange someplace, and so I started researching her, and believe it or not, I found her born as a husmannsjente, which is the lowest of the low, on a farm called Ottestad. So when I wrote a letter of thanks to the owner of this farm for a lovely evening, I said, "Oh, by the way, 4 years later, I was doing research in a place called Hamar, staying at the home of the local archivist." He says, "One evening, we were invited out to dinner to a farm called Ottestad. This time the farmer was ready. He met us at the gate, gave each one of us a cane, and I remember one of mine was one of these crooked things. He had a couple of young historians there, and we took a walk across plowed paths, cow paths and plowed fields and all sorts of things like that. Finally, about 3/4 of a mile into a clearing in the woods. There was a house, the roof had fallen in, obviously had been abandoned long ago. And he said, "I think this is where your great-great-grandmother was born." So I've had people tell me similar things, and they've said, "And yes, you left out one ingredient." And they said, "And you cried." Well, there's a little bit of that. There's a tug, and I don't care whether you're Yugoslav or Finnish or Norwegian or whatever, that tug is there and all that. I'm going to give you one other reason, and Pat touched on this morning, but I'll give you a personal, shall we say, testimony as to saying genealogy may help you understand yourself. Now, as Ed said, I've been in library work professionally all my life. I've gotten into genealogy. I love history. I've been deeply involved with the work of the church. Why? Well, I've discovered some things. I've discovered that one of my remote ancestors in Norway was the first man in Norway to do some printing, number one. Number two, I discovered that another ancestor had quite a library, and when he died, it went to one of his sons, and his son died without an estate, without any descendants, and so his library went to the city of Oslo and was the start of their public library, the Deichman Library. I'm a Deichman. Well, is that coincidence? Is it coincidence that at least for 10 generations back, not along the same line necessarily, but somewhere along the line, in every generation I find at least one clergyman? I guess I was stuck. And maybe you'll find that many of you have similar explanations as to why you are what you are. Okay, let's talk about Norwegians, and really I'm going to concentrate today because I can't, Ed says I'm not supposed to give my usual 4-hour lecture on Norwegian genealogy and how one can learn more about your families. And maybe if you're Swede or Yugoslav or something else, you'll say, well, maybe there's something like this someplace for me, or if there isn't, maybe I should start something. I don't usually do it this way, but I think maybe it'll fit this particular group. Not through plan on my part. I didn't plan it this way at all. We have developed in Madison, Wisconsin, a Center for Norwegian Genealogical Research. Repeat, I didn't have this thing in mind at all, but people like Berlin and a few other people have done this and that or asked questions and so on, and The result, we've developed a center. Actually, it started in 1974-5, when the Norwegian American Museum down in Decorah decided it was tired of all these genealogical letters they were going to get it. So they sicked them onto me, and at the same time they created, without asking me, a Vesterheim Genealogical Center, and said, "You're it." That was all. Well, we've developed, a little bit like Topsy, but we now have a pretty good plan and a pretty good resource and actually a very good team. What do we have? Maybe that's the best way to start. Well, thanks to bygdelags, and there are a few people in this room who know what a bygdelag is. It's an association of essentially Americans who have banded together, who have come from a particular part of Norway. A bygdelag. Thanks to the bygdelags, who have given a fair amount of money, we have in Madison now on microfilm the church records for a great many Norwegian communities. In many cases, all of the records that are available. We have a few probate records. We want more. We have quite a bit of census material. And one thing that we use steadily and daily, we have on microfiche all of the 1801 census for Norway, which is my way of saying that if you are of Norwegian background, I know we have something about some of your ancestors. I might not be able to help you find it, but it's there. All right, what else do we have? We have the current telephone books for Norway, and I think it was Verlin who got us started on that. We have done some crazy things. Conrad and I were talking, it takes a few crazy people in this world to keep genealogy going. Well, we've done some crazy things in Madison. One of us, and he's standing in front of you, has gone through all of the census records for the Midwestern states for 1850, 60, and 80, and pulled out all of the names of the Norwegians. And a good many of those are indexed. In fact, this was of such interest to two men, fortunately two young men, in Norway, that they said two things. Number one, could we have a copy of what you've done? I sent it, and I don't know how much postage I spent because I sent it in lots of bundles, and all was airmail. Then they wrote back and said, could we index it? I said, yeah, provided that if there's any American distribution of that I do it. So we have on our shows maybe about this much, in 8.5 by 11 sheets, indexes by first names to the Norwegians in the American census for 1880 for the Midwestern states. And we're expanding on that. This is a wonderful way for finding people. Now, I think it was Pat who complained about the spelling. Well, we're stuck with that, but then we throw in our imagination a little bit, and often we can find the answers. So we have that. Then, let's see, what else do we have? We've copied about 300 Norwegian American cemeteries and are buying from one place or another, or begging, or borrowing, or even stealing census transcripts that have been done by others. For instance, we have purchased the North Dakota ones done by, I guess it's the Moose or whatever they want to call it, River Genealogical Society, and we're watching for other things like that. In fact, I've been listening today to what is being done in this area, and I may be coming around begging, borrowing, or stealing. I'm not quite sure some of the census things that have been done up here. But we have that. Now you may say, is that indexed? Some of it is, and we intend to do more. Now I'm going to backtrack a little because it's important for you to understand maybe how we can help or how we may someday be able to help. I don't know how big this room is, but imagine a room 175 square feet. I believe it would run from about this end of this blackboard back maybe 2/3 of the way towards the door and over to the wall. Tain't an awful lot of space. Well, we have jammed into that room most of what I've described, along with a few other things that I'm going to get to. One computer, 2 film readers, 2 fiche readers, and a few chairs. Now picture, if you will, one day, not too long ago, when our whole staff of 6, our whole staff was there, and 15 visitors. Well, that's the day we handed out numbers. But you would say, well, that's pretty awful. How in the world can you stand it? Well, we can't stand it. So what we have done is gone to our membership and friends and one very generous foundation. And right now we have a fund of $404,000 with which we've been shopping for a building. Now, 200 of that is, shall we say, earmarked for endowment and for equipment. But there's $204,000 for buying a building. We have identified the right building. It's 8 blocks from the university library. It's 3 stories. It's been equipped for building and computers and all sorts of things like that. Once, if we get it, we can move right in without any renovation of any kind. And the little trouble is it's listed at $259. So right now, and I'm not necessarily looking at any of you, but I am looking around for $55,000. And Verlin, that's of course one reason we've got you on the committee as of a week from now. But anyway, maybe next July 1, if all goes well, we're going to move into a building of our own. And we have a few more microfilm readers stashed away in the garage of one of our members. I hope it isn't rusting too much, and various other things. We are scavengers. We have a young man in our gang by the name of Blaine who is found in junk yards, thrown away microfilm reading machines. He's polished them up and got them working. I think we paid a whole $5 for a microfiche reader. We know that at our new place we want a printer. And he says, well, I know we can get one for $600 down at a certain place. Well, I think this case we're going to go new. But anyway, all I'm saying is down the road we're going to be much more effective than we are. Now, you don't care about that in one sense. You want to find out, well, how do we proceed at this? But I thought I ought to give you that little background for understanding where we are at in terms of serving. This Vesterham Genealogical Center now is aiming at helping any Norwegian anywhere in the world at finding genealogical help. We had a visitor from New Zealand the other day, so I can honestly say that we're getting around. You may say, well, that's quite a bite. Of course it's quite a bite. I've forgotten who, it was Verlin who was throwing statistics around here. I think that means we are pretending to have control of maybe 10 million names. Of course we don't. But in theory, that's where we're getting at. But let's now be in practice. Maybe I should use a case or two to tell what we do and what you might do. Now, one case that we won't touch is this. I understand that in an office in Oslo, in something called the Norsemen's Federation, they have a letter on their bulletin board which reads something like this. Dear Norsemen's Federation, I would like to learn more about my ancestry. My great-grandfather was Ole Peterson, or was it Ole Olsen? He emigrated somewhere in the 1800s, either from Oslo or Bergen or somewhere in between. Would you please send me his family tree? Well, believe me, we have gotten letters almost like that. Now, we've had the name Peterson thrown around here, and I remember distinctly getting a letter from a young boy in Norway saying, my great-grandfather left for Norway about 100 years ago, leaving behind a pregnant young girl. His name was Ole Peterson, and we do know he lived on such and such a street in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1900. Please find his family. Well, I worked on it a little, but when I discovered that that house had been raised to make way for a factory and a few other things, I gave up on Ole Peterson. But we do get that kind of letter. But we get some others that, shall we say, have from people who have done their homework. And Pat was giving a wonderful base for that kind of thing. I won't spend time on what she's done, but I will move to some logical next steps. If I were in your shoes, and I'm just going to say one of you here is the Norwegian I'm talking about, and I don't know which one you are, it is vitally important to do some homework. Yes, sit down with that notebook on pages 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and so on, as far as you can, and get as much of a base as you can. Well, there's some things going for you. I think I can say honestly that Mr. Widstrad, even more than on the Swedes, the Norwegians have really done things that help. We have compiled books and records far more than most, but let me be specific. For example, currently down in the archives of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and I have a little trouble with that because I'm so used to some other ones, there are on microfilms the church records for a great many Norwegian Lutheran churches, mostly up to about 1900. They used to be down in Dubuque, and at one time, and that's where I got acquainted with them, they were in St. Paul. They wandered around a little. They used to be more available than they are now, but you can go down to Chicago to use them. Under certain circumstances, you can buy copies. I won't dwell on this, but I just say there is a wealth of that. And one of you and I were talking, is it better to do research in Norway than in the United States on this kind of thing? Well, in one sense, even on this, it's better. Because would you believe it, there is a complete set of these in the Emigrant Museum in Hamar, Norway. My, how I wish I had their pull. But the material is there. Well, this is, in my mind, the best source for names, places, dates that you can find. Well, my team and I have started, and when we get more space, we're going to do much more. We're dreaming, shall we say, maybe even planning, to index, I don't dare say all, but let's pretend we will, all of this material so that we can find our way much more clearly, easily. There's a problem with this kind of record, more than, of course, any other ethnic group in this room. The Norwegians are stubborn. They are cantankerous. They have had discussions, in fact, drag-out fights on subjects related to religion. Now, I'm not a theologian, so I will tell it my way. I'll point to Verlin here and say, are you saved? Well, if you are saved, it means that God knows and there isn't a darn thing he can do about it. Or maybe you'll say, no, I guess I'm not saved. And then the discussion will be, well, what can you do about that? Well, I guess it's this, the point is almost like the pinhead or the head of a needle as to which way you go. Are you saved or you aren't? Well, we Norwegians back around 1883 just had an awful time of this. So much so that we split, and not always in a very friendly way. I know families split and sometimes didn't talk for generations. Worse yet, They built, of course, second churches, and almost side by side. I know of one up near Winchester or Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where the second church was built close enough, and they adjusted their service schedule so that one preacher was trying to preach, he'd hear all this loud organ from the next one. That's one way. On the other hand, I know they managed somehow to share the cemetery, but that's about as far as they got. Well, it was awful. Well, what has that got to do with genealogy? A great deal, because it means very simply that even if you think that you have found the right place for your family, you may have to look in several sets of records. Now, I mentioned what we call predestination, the saved business. We differed about a lot of other things. Well, almost anything that came up, the Norwegians would differ on. There's no question about that. Even after the Civil War, we split on the subject of slavery, whether it was right and proper to have, whether slavery was covered by the Bible and all that sort of thing. That was in 1870. We've split on other things. We've joined, as I think it was Verlin that mentioned, we've joined. Sometimes we joined briefly. We didn't do it too long with the Swedes. We joined a little more at length with the Danes, and we've finally gotten back to that. But the thing is, you have to study church, and I don't mean national history, but local church history to see where just maybe your records are. One of the wonderful guides for this is a 2-volume set, and I think I have listed it in my bibliography, which I hope all of you have, by a man named Norley. He covered virtually all of the churches and even preaching places around. The part I enjoy on this most is where he mentions, for most of these congregations, the number of members. And this is the way it reads: 360 souls, 3 Swedes, 2 Danes. And I still wonder whether they're included in the souls. That's right, isn't it, Verlin? The Swedes weren't. All right, I'm glad to be told this. But anyway, that's there. But forgetting that, it's a wonderful resource. The way I use this set mostly, and this may be a clue for you, I look at the history and see who the pastors were when. And if I don't find my Ole Peterson in a certain set of records, or I cannot find the records for a church, let's say, that existed in 1863, I look at this pastor's name, and then I look at his biography and figure out maybe where his base church was. And the chances are that the record that you want is in the, shall we say, the home church. I can use this exactly down in my territory. I live in a county called Dane County, and in Madison, the capital city. 20 miles out in the country is a community called Spring Prairie. And perhaps the biggest financial wheel in Madison in the last century was a man named Hollis Steensland. Why, I don't know, but his marriage is not recorded in the churches in Madison. He's out there at Spring Prairie, because at that time that was the most influential church. So again, I can spend a lot of time on that because it's fascinating, but you may want to look at that congregational history a bit more. Well, Pat referred to cemeteries this morning. I agree absolutely with things that she said, but I'd like to take it one further step. What is etched into marble isn't necessarily so. Think of who put that information on the tombstone. Usually it wasn't Grandpa, it was Grandpa's kids. And Grandpa's kids may have even had to have a debate as well. Now, was Grandpa, how old was Grandpa anyway, and when was he born? Well, I don't know if I can echo, what was it, 13 years difference that I heard in some regard today, but it's not unusual at all to find a difference of a year or 2 or 3. In my family, I guess he's a blood relative, was a very, very famous Minnesotan. And I did a paper for my master's in history and on him, and among other things, I looked him up in Who's Who, and then I found his birth record, and it was a year off. His name is Andy Volstead. Oh, the old-timers know. Yeah, all right. Yeah. He really influenced behavior in the state for 15 whole years, but with the Volstead Act. But anyway, all I'm saying is don't trust what you find on tombstones or even county histories or even who's who's, because things are so dependent on what people tell or sometimes hear. But I do use cemeteries a great deal. One of the big things about a cemetery, at least Norwegian cemeteries, is that people are organized in cemeteries by lot, and therefore by family. I'll tell a story that a Norwegian was over doing research in this country, and he got down to a cemetery in Stoughton, and he made an awful lot of notes. And one day he wrote me and said, "Gerhard, can you tell me who that Anna is in a certain lot?" Well, I'd copied that cemetery, so I quick looked there, and there was a young lady in a lot. The old man of the house had died at about the age of 80, and she was about 40 years younger than he. And she just didn't fit into the family chart that people had, and that certainly my friend Lars had. So I went to my good friend Lorraine and said, "Can you tell me what went on there?" "Oh," she says, "yeah." She said, the man's wife died, and he went back to Norway and found a young one. Well, the lots can be very, very useful in our cemeteries, and finding some things that maybe you didn't always want to find. And you referred to census, Pat. Sometimes the census will turn up some children that you never knew existed, so that's there. Now, in my work, I have some delicate things to work with. A lady wrote us a month ago and said, "My great-grandmother emigrated with her husband and 5 kids. Can you tell me more about them?" Well, I found out that she didn't get married to this man until after they came to America, and she came with 5 illegitimate children by at least 4 men. Why do I say at least 4? 2 of the fathers were named Ole, and I don't know if there's one Ole or 2. Well, in genealogy, I guess I've learned to say, or rather to tell it like it is. And you have to form your own conclusions and cover up your tracks, if you will. In fact, I have a friend in Madison, his name is Gene Norby, who, when he introduces me, he likes to have a little fun, and he said, "You know, genealogy is a very expensive business. I know a man that got his genealogy compiled, it cost him a whole $2,000, and then $4,000 to cover it up." Well, I'm getting, you know, I do like to have a little fun with this kind of thing, but this is also a very serious business. All right. Very quickly, we've talked about church records, census. Let me be Norwegian from the point of view of passenger lists. Many passenger lists are excellent. Many of them are not. There is a fact on the Norwegian that between 1854 and 64, it is virtually no use to look for a passenger list. Because about the middle of 53, they started coming in through Quebec. Quebec did not start passenger lists until 65. And then even those lists in 65 to 70, what have they done? Keep in mind that, of course, Canada was a British possession. And they have several columns. They will first list the name and hopefully the age and the sex. Then they come to column England, Scotland, Ireland, and then the Norwegians and the Yugoslavs and anything else come in on other. Can you imagine not even the Swedes being separated from the Norwegians on a passenger list? So, as I say, often they are very bad. But they can be very good, because once in a while they preserved the list prepared by the Norwegian captain. There is a local historian in Norway by the name of Dordi Galerum Skugevik. And one time she wrote me and she says, you know, for this book that I'm writing, I would so like to have such and such a passenger list. And I found it without much trouble, and it was a case where not only did they list the usual things, but actually gave the home community in Norway. And I Xeroxed and sent it back to her, and of course it was everything she wanted. And she said, this is the kind of letter I don't get very often, but she said, I love you, I love you, I love you. That's the kind of fun that a genealogist can have once in a blue moon. But passenger lists can help. I love passenger lists because they do add a little to family history, and I've worked with them a great deal. In fact, I've copied all of the Norwegians in Canadian and American passenger lists up through 1870, except for 1 year, and that was an accident, and I've forgotten why. And I've indexed a lot of this. So if you're lucky enough to have ancestors that came from Norway before 1870, I might be able to help you, provided that you remember about this 10-year gap when it's just no use even looking. All right, I could spend much more time on things American, but let's move over to Norway. Now, this is old stuff to one or two of you, and especially to Verlin here, because he's had a part in this. Conrad, we were saying, you know, there are a few crazy people in this world. About 80% of them are over in Norway. Because they've done things that I don't really think any other country has done at all, or if at all, very little. There is a term or a word called bygdebok. Book, B-O-K, simply book. Bygd, let's call it a local community, and really we're talking about local rural communities. And Norway has gone wild, delightfully wild, in preparing bygdebøker, that's the plural. There are local histories for most of the communities in Norway, and there are more coming out. Some of them are awful. I have talked with some local historians in Norway who were educated in the university, and I should turn up my nose quite the way I did, but almost. And they had certain guidelines for writing what they called farm histories. And some of them followed those rules very carefully, and so they carefully give the history of the farms in terms of how many acres and how much they planted and how much forestry they had and how many chickens and all that, but scarcely a mention even of the names of the owners. Well, I met one of those local historians of that school of thought, and I said, I noticed that some of you historians, and you're one of them, that write a history like that. I've also seen some that go a great deal into family history as well. Then I was mean. I said, which ones sell? And his face fell. And of course, the ones that go into family sell far more. But let's talk about those a little. There are bibliographies. In fact, there's a new one that isn't even on the list, which lists that kind of book from, I think it's 1969 to 89, put out by the Norwegian Local History Society. If you're persistent, and I hope you are, you can find out by one means or another whether there might be one for your local community. Well, there's some in here who say, but I don't know that local community. Well, that's where you're going to have to do some homework. But there are some things you can do. More than any other place, Norwegian names, family names, mean something. They mean something in terms of where your folks may have come from. Now, I'm not talking about the names that are very common, like Dahl and Bucken and a few things like that, where, well, those two names mean valley and hill, and that's all Norway's got. So there are thousands of farms with that kind of name. But if you happen to have a name that's a little more original or unique, sometimes even the name will tell where you came from. I'll just pick some out of the air. If one of you were to tell me, my name is Fudness, well, I'd say, well, you either come from Voss or you come from Valdres. If your name is Skjelkvala, and I hope not, I do know that you come from Skjåk and Gudbrandsdal. We can go on and on like that. I had experience talking to a crowd like you several years ago in Coon Rapids. And in the question period, a lady held up her hand and she said, how can I trace my family in Hjartdal? Well, I said, it all depends on what farm. What farm do you people come from? She said, well, our farm is Acre. I said, hello, cousin. And she turned out to be my third cousin. All I'm saying is now I have to be a little careful on this, but I'll try it out for size. Every established farm in Norway has its name, which has persisted to the present time. Now, there are many, many qualifications to that, but let's take that as a base. So that, well, now my name is Naeseth, and if you've been around a bit, you know my name is spelled several different ways. Well, I suppose, and I haven't looked, I suppose maybe there are a dozen places in Norway that have Naeseth farms. It means a point of land sticking out into a lake, tiny little peninsula. Well, suppose I hadn't known where my Naeseths come from. What I would do is take those dozen Naeseth farms and tend to eliminate, and finally I get to one, and hopefully it turns out to be the right one. What I guess I'm really saying to you is it's a part of your Norwegian genealogical research to determine the farm name and therefore the farm from which your people came. Now that might not be so simple. Let's take my own great-grandpa. He came over in 1844. I have seen him in American records with 3 different last names. Gunderson, sure. Naeseth, sure. But then there was another farm called Olsbrygge. And the reason was, well, when the pastor wrote down something about him, a new kid or something like that, it depended on how the pastor remembered this man. And sometimes he was better known by a farm he'd lived on a little earlier than the Naeseth farm from which he emigrated immediately. So you're going to have to do some research. Now, I said there are exceptions. Many of these established farms have been divided and subdivided, well, frankly, until you're blue in the face sometimes. So some of these farms are simply called Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. But many of them have developed names of their own, and sometimes the immigrant has come over with that sub-farm name. Well, let's just hope that you have done enough homework that you come up with a farm name. I have not forgotten the lady on whom I spent a fair amount of time one time, and I got nowhere. And finally I wrote to her, isn't there something else? Well, she says, you know, I probably should have said this. There's a name that they've used from time to time in our family. It turned out to be a farm name. It was the whole clue. And so just take very seriously the need for that. You can find it most of the time by just persisting, looking up every reference to your family in this country. With luck, something is going to show. It has happened to me many times. You keep looking up Ole Peterson until sometime they said, well, also Skjelkvala or Dala or something. Keep after it until you find that. Now, sometimes you can get along without that, because many Norwegian American records go one further step. If you look at the membership part, or sometimes the confirmation record or the marriage record, it will tell where the person involved was born. And then, of course, again, you're off for the races. Now, where can you, these Bygdebøker, it does help to know Norwegian, but don't let that throw you, because somebody and I were looking at some printing a few minutes ago, and you can generally work out much of what's written in Norwegian. Norwegian grammar is very much like English in many of the words, so don't give up on that. But where can you find these books? I'll give you several places. Concordia College, where Verlin comes from. You've got a pretty good collection of them. Yep. Not terribly far from where he lives is a place called Grand Forks, and the University of North Dakota has a good collection. There's one difference between Verlin and North Dakota. He lends, they don't. Now maybe people like to have, maybe Grand Forks wants lots of visitors. I don't know what the reason is, but anyway. But they do have a good collection. St. Olaf College in Northfield has, Luther College has. Obviously there's an excellent collection out at Salt Lake City. They don't lend theirs. Well, I've been having a running debate with the Norwegian leaders at Salt Lake City. Who has the best collection of this kind of history in the United States? They said they did. I said we did in Madison. So one day their genealogical bishop came to Madison and I gave him a tour. He says, you have. So down in Madison we have an excellent collection. Now, I'm going to put in a plug for something else. We're not anxious for a lot of visitors in Madison, but you might like to know that in our State Historical Society, we have on microfilm all of the available American census records for all of the states for all of the years. So regardless of what you are, if you happen to be in the kind of spot where that kind of thing can get you over a few humps, that's one of the good places to go. Now maybe St. Paul has it, I don't know. If they don't, I know they'd like to have it. All right. I've put in quite a plug for the Norwegian local histories. I've put in a good plug for the church records. There are other things. It's a funny thing about Norwegians, they can do just about anything that anybody else can. They somehow get born and they get married and they get died. But they do get some other things. As one of you said, they get vaccinated. I think you, Verlin, said that. These things are recorded. They get confirmed. Those things are recorded. And then there's a lovely section, I think of it as lovely, in the back of most of these church books, where they list those, and I first give it my way, innflyttede and utflyttede. And my translation of those words is flew in and flew out. Well, people don't seem to like that. But it's a list of those who moved into the parish and moved out. You say, Gerhard, is it complete? No. But it's still quite helpful. So I guess maybe I'll pause and tell you about a project I've been doing, which again might bear on things you're doing, and is a little bit like what Conrad's been doing. I adopted a project whereby I am collecting every possible bit of information about the Norwegians who came from Norway between 1825 and 1850. Only 18,000 people. Well, one of the wonderful sources was being able to go back to the Norwegian church records, to that section at the back, and simply copy what was said about every emigrant going to America in those particular years. It's a wonderful starting place, and actually was the base for my card and later what I call a worksheet file. So that, let's say, Ole Petersen Fadnes emigrated in 1849 from Voss with wife and children. And what I've tried to do is, of course, put all of those names and any information that this utflyttede gave, and then built on it, first by going to the church records, Norwegian church records,
then to these Bygdeböcker, then to the passenger lists, and then to American records. And that's one reason, as Pat put it, the 1850 census is pretty good. This was by mooring post. Try to identify them in America by place, church, burial place, and of course try to find out some things about the children that were born in this country. Well, so if any of you have American ancestors who came from Norway in that period, I'd love to hear from you. I'd say the chances are about 99 out of 100 that I've got something about your family. And I'm in the process of preparing that for printing. Verlin says, when are you going to get that done? Well, who was it that talked about getting these books ready? It ain't all that easy. And of course, the rub is I'm always finding new material. But anyway, let's jump away. But just so you know that project exists. I'm kind of watching my time because I'm a little different from you. You're going to stay here, but at 12:15 I am going to go to lunch. What you do, I don't care. But let's suppose you are literally stumped and yet you want to find out about your Norwegian roots. I'm prejudiced, of course I am. I think that the thing you might do is compile what you do know and send it to us in Madison and do one or two or three things. Number one, do you have any suggestions on how we can proceed? I'd like to do my own work, and believe me, we approve of that. It's a wonderful learning process. It's also frustrating, but that's another one. Or you might say, would you spend an hour or two and we'll pay for it? By the way, in contrast with this center, we do not get any outside support, so we're dependent on fees and that sort of stuff. But see what you can do in an hour or two to find out where we come from. And often we can do things quickly. In other words, we've concentrated on knowing these names that I've talked about, on patterns of the kind that Verlin has discussed, of some of the basic ways of doing things that Pat has talked about, and Ed. Or you might say, well, I just got an inheritance from my uncle and I've got $1,000 to spend. See what you could do with $1,000. Well, no one's done that yet. But we have gotten $400 or $500 from a few people to say, well, go to work and see what you can do. Well, we've developed one rule of thumb. We do not write family histories. We would never get done if we do that. But we do try to find answers. And we find them surprisingly often. And sometimes I surprise myself. I've had a basic rule of thumb that you don't find much in the way of obituaries in American newspapers before 1900. Well, I had a letter from Norway a couple of weeks ago saying, we'd like to know how a certain man died in Ashland. They knew the exact date, Ashland, Wisconsin. Well, and he was an immigrant boy. Well, I just said, well, let's try. So I got the Ashland newspaper on the reader, and on the first page I looked at, here he was on the front page because he'd had the good sense to fall dead on the main street. Well, you never know what's going to be in these papers. I have found obituaries in the 1850s and 60s. Again, you have to know where to look. I'm plugging for newspapers. You can find wonderful things in them. You'll find surprises. I found a branch of my family that landed near Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and so I started reading the Dodgeville Chronicle. I found lots of things I didn't quite care about. I did find one, read something like this. John Peterson went calling on Mary Olson last Sunday. We think something is brewing there. I found one of my relatives, said moved to Wyoming, and I waved her goodbye until I found that Wyoming was the next township up the road. Well, these are kind of things you have to be alert for. I'm sort of spanking me once in a while. I've been kind of dumb in this. Back to these Bygdeböcker, these community histories. Back when I started working on my family history, I sat down with Auntie and with a good fat blank notebook and got lots of things. Well, this same O.M. Norley that I referred to on these congregations married into my family, and one time I ran into him, and he says, "How are you coming?" "Oh, I'm doing pretty well, but I haven't learned much about the family back in Norway." Well, he says, "Have you used the Hollebook?" What's the Hollebook? Well, that was the local community, or the history for the local community where my people came from, and the history was all there. Well, I, as a university librarian, should have known better that there might be something like that, but I never dreamt that Norwegians had that kind of thing. Boy, I know now. Now, these things are expensive. Berlin, I don't know, maybe you can back this up or say I haven't dared try it. Doris from Normansforbundet was in our town 3-4 months ago, and I said, "Doris, I'd like to try something." She says, "I'm ready to cooperate." So I sent her an order for every bygdebok published in 1990. And the other day I had a phone call from Milwaukee from the customs office. What are we going to do with this big bundle? Well, we arranged that. And the stuff was delivered, and I got Doris's bill. $1,700 for the local histories published in Norway in 1 year. And now, how much was it? About that long, about that high, and maybe about this thick. Gives you an idea. These things are expensive. They're running $50, $60, $80, and even $100. I think I saw one for $120. So that, yes, you can spend a lot of money, but my, what treasures there are. Again, Verlin quoted from his own experience. Let me quote from mine. Two of my ancestors, a number of years ago, and I won't tell you how many or where, had an illegitimate child. One of my ancestors, well, more than one. One of my ancestors is illegitimate. Charles, one of yours is. And in this particular bygdebok, I found the parents, each of whom married, and each of whom had about 8-10 children on the two different lines. So I got all sorts of half-relatives. And the nice thing about this particular community, it traced it down almost to the present day. So that if I were to get serious on this thing, I could find relatives by, well, the thousands over there. But yes, indeed, the books can be very helpful, sometimes very frustrating. Sometimes they tell the truth, the kind of truth that I'm talking about, because some of them will list such and such, and then it will say quietly, sort of at a little side or a footnote, and then John had another child by Mary back, and so then that child is, so-and-so who took such and such a farm. Those things sometimes are there. We're not too delicate. Now, I'm going to say on a positive side, it's an impression on my part. I cannot swear to this. But you may say, there must have been a lot of immorality in Norway. Not in any of the other countries, of course, but I am not sure that's it. Because life was tough back then, money was scarce, and it was kind of understood that when you married a wife or a husband, that somehow you had arranged for your survival. And it's my guess, number one, that many times things happened when they weren't financially ready. And also, if you know Norway's geography, sometimes things happened and you were many mountainous miles away from the pastor who might marry you. Now, child, I have worse news for you. Two other ancestors of mine, well, this isn't so bad. Two other ancestors of mine were married on the occasion of the baptism of their second child. What's the hurry in this world? And then I have 2 minutes, I'll tell you one other little thing. Some of you are going to find that you are your own cousins. Back in my Norwegian ancestry, obviously in a mountainous valley, a certain couple had 3 daughters. Life was tough, and each of those daughters married twice. I'm directly descended from all 6 marriages, and my wife says that explains a lot.